Hello, everybody, and good morning. My name is Don Arleth, and welcome to Press Corner, our regular Sunday morning review of key events with our colleagues in the media here in the heart of Europe. On Press Corner, we celebrate the privilege of free press by listening to diverse opinions and letting our audience reach their own conclusions. Today, I'd like to introduce our guests, Karolina Wojcicka. Thank you very much for joining us. Małgorzata Zawadzka. And hello, thank you for joining us. And Joe Harper, great to see you.
Good morning.
Well, I believe the main subject of today's discussion is going to be the U.S. elections. And of course, it's certainly turning out to be quite exciting. We've seen a lot of action, and now we've seen a change of candidates. So let's start off with, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, who signed forms declaring her candidacy for president on Friday. Now with only 100 days left until the presidential election, Kamala HQ is working to gather as much support as possible. For our conversation together here in the studio, I invite you to watch this introductory footage.
Joe Biden exited the presidential race after a shaky debate performance and amid mounting pressure within his own party to step down. Many believe that replacing a candidate so late in the race comes with a significant disadvantage, and selecting a candidate other than Kamala Harris would make the short campaign even more frantic. Harris has access to Biden's $96 million war chest and can run on her track record as vice president. She is, however, also associated with what her critics have deemed failures of the Biden administration: the border crisis and the failure to codify abortion rights. Who sits in the White House is of paramount importance to NATO and its members on the eastern flank. Warsa's residents, for the most part, seem to have taken Biden's decision to withdraw from the race with relief.
It's good that Biden resigned. Everyone has their dusk of life, don't they?
It's the perfect time with respect to the election calendar in the United States and Europe's current undertakings to convince U.S. politicians and public opinion that Europe has pulled itself together. We spend more on defense and we are not a stowaway when it comes to supporting Ukraine.
Under the Biden administration, the United States established its first permanent garrison of troops in Poland. A record number of over 10,000 soldiers are currently stationed there. Kamala Harris is expected to largely continue Biden's foreign policy if elected. One of the few exceptions is Israel, as Harris portrayed herself as a more moderate Israel ally than Biden. It was met with enthusiasm by her base. The latest opinion poll conducted by Forbes shows support for the Democratic candidate at 47%, still trailing behind ex-President Donald Trump at 53% support. Still, the latest polls show a smaller gap in support between the Democratic and the Republican candidates than in early July, when President Joe Biden was still the candidate. Harris has yet to choose a running mate. Currently, roughly a dozen potential vice presidential candidates are being considered by Kamala HQ.
So now we have a big breath of fresh air, some would say, in the campaign, especially on the Democratic side. Karolina, let's start with you. This Kamala Harris entering the fray, if you will, as the lead candidate, as the potential Democratic nominee. How does this shake up the dynamics of the race? She's a whole generation younger than President Trump, and so it gives voters in the United States very different considerations this time instead of having Joe Biden with Kamala Harris.
Nikki Haley, a Republican who also had presidential ambitions, she once said that the party that changes their candidate for a woman will win the elections. Well, I don't think that necessarily it must be true, but there is something to this statement. I think it changes a lot the situation, the dynamic in the United States right now, and we see that from Donald Trump's narrative. He was convinced that he will fight this older man who can't really walk, who can't really speak anymore precisely, and he seemed like a very dynamic man in his prime time. Now it's Kamala Harris. She's way younger. She's funny. She's energetic. So he has a lot of challenges in front of him. But so does Kamala Harris. When she was a vice president, she used to be she didn't have her own voice, sort of. That's the ungrateful role of the VP because the VP doesn't have that many constitutional powers. So people, the Americans, they don't really know, I think, what are her political views on some issues. So for her to win, I think she needs to distance herself a little bit from Joe Biden to show that she's different, to show that she's young, to prove the young voters that, yeah, she is really the young generation. I think those TikTok trends and Kamala is broad trend, it's not enough to gain younger voters' support.
The glass ceiling that Hillary Clinton tried to break, can Kamala Harris break this glass ceiling?
We'll see. The voters will tell us. I hope the biases against women and against people of color are behind American nation. Of course, it's very hard to say. That's why I think even in the polls, they will be not so believable, because we tend to say in the polls what we wish we would like, we wish about ourselves, but when it comes to voting and buying, at the moment of voting and buying, we might actually play on our hidden biases, even from ourselves. So we will learn a lot about American nation this election. That's the first thing. To me, it's enough. Like comparing to Donald Trump, she's believable, she's experienced, she is not a left-wing crazy person as the Trump MAGA Republicans are trying to paint her. To me, personally, because she redefined what it means to be a young woman. She's going to be 60 in October. So please, everyone, remember, when you are 60 and you are a female, you are young, energetic, beautiful, and you are in time for higher positions. That's something totally new, because she's actually on 60 years old. So to me, it's unbelievable. And the level of excitement, when we were talking, you started with excitement, polls, they are showing that she's 2-3 points behind Donald Trump, but what's really important is the level of excitement. And the polls show that 81% of Democrats are excited because of Kamala Harris, and they were just, the excitement polls were in the 20s, or in the 20s if it came to Joe Biden. Of course, I totally agree with Carolina that she has to prove herself. Because what's really dangerous, and that gives MAGA camp a very believable argument, is that she did not went through primaries. So she kind of got this amazing opportunity from Joe Biden, and it was his great sacrifice that she has it, but it's a strong argument that she did not earn it in full.
She'll have to prove herself. What do you think the key areas of policy will be for Kamala Harris to garner the most amount of votes, especially from the Democrats?
Can I just say something about that? I agree with everything you just said, and I think it's fantastic and all of those things. But a large proportion of Americans don't believe that, right? I mean, that's the issue, and that's the divide that MAGA has kind of created or, exploited. I guess it's abortion, migration. Question is, I think, to some extent, whether or not she will continue the Biden kind of economic approach as well. We don't really know who she is, right? I mean, politically, as a VP, she's been under the radar for the last 3.5 years. So, in a sense, we don't know. She'll be tested, I guess, up to the election, but it will be on the terrain of kind of culture wars. Wokeism or whatever. That's the way that MAGA will probably attempt to pitch the contest. As a president, we don't know. We have no idea. I think that the interesting thing also is that as a young woman, she's 60, almost 60.
Don't laugh.
Yeah,
It's
sorry.
very dangerous to laugh
But
this
you have
time.
J.D. Vance is 38, 39. something like
39.
that. I mean, he's...
And he said actually that, before she became a candidate, J.D. Vance said, like, look, she's not that much younger than Joe Biden during the Republican speech. So.
But I think that was part of... I mean, the thing that she's done, or the Democrats have done very successfully, it seems to me, is whether they did it by intention or whether it was just, an accident, is that they've allowed Trump to pitch a kind of MAGA, an ultra-MAGA project. With J.D. Vance as their pick, they've now been undercut because Kamala is obviously going to come in and kind of embody everything, a woman of colour, right? I mean, that's the kind of antithesis of what MAGA considers to be the...
Which some would say caught the Trump campaign by surprise.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe he made the wrong vice presidential pick
exactly.
for this particular race.
I saw yesterday, I think he's -6 in the favourability polls, J.D. Vance.
Yes, he's the least popular.
He's the least popular
nominee for VP in the United States history.
Yeah, and that's a disaster, I guess, for the Trump campaign. But it may be, all the things that you're talking about, the enthusiasm and the the dynamism that's somehow been kind of galvanized, maybe will work. But you've got these swing states which are very divided, right? And it may be that the kind of traditional MAGA Trump approach, if it's kind of doubled down, will work in those swing states.
Well, I think it's about whoever is going to rile their base the most or get their voters excited to go out and cast their vote in this election is probably going to become victorious, because if we look at the current polls, I mean, it's simply a coin toss at this point. And therefore, it's going to be similar to when we saw Barack Obama get elected. Mm-hmm. He was able to mobilize the voters and get them out to the polls. Donald Trump was able to do the same thing in 2016, so most likely that will...
But again, it comes down to... Sorry, I mean, Hillary Clinton won more votes than Trump in 2016, right? It comes down to these swing states.
Also, we tend to forget that...
Sorry.
Yeah, no, please go.
No, continue, sorry.
Because we tend to forget something, that Barack Obama did not have Donald Trump to run against. Barack Obama had John McCain in the first election, then he had Mitt Romney. They were old-time Republicans, very gallant and very nice. Of course, he had a tremendous criticism and also all the worst, anti-black, especially demons, they were in the campaign very present, but the official candidate did not use these cards against him, even actually were defending him from it. Here, Donald Trump will use every possible dirty trick to show that Kamala Harris is crazy leftist who doesn't know what she's talking about.
And the problem is right now that there are three important groups for Kamala Harris. It's black people, it's Hispanic people, and it's young voters under 35 years old, let's say.
Under 60.
Under 60, yeah, we can make that like that. And the problem is that when Joe Biden was still a candidate, Donald Trump was leading in two of those three groups, except for the black people. Now, Kamala Harris is leading, but the problem is that 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, when Joe Biden was running for the first time, the margin was way bigger between him and Donald Trump in those three groups. So, yes, Kamala is leading, but she's way behind Joe Biden from 4 years ago.
We have, there's another group, probably they talk about suburban women, yes. Right? That's probably the fourth group to be added to that. And that is, I think that J.D. Vance has made some very strange comments about abortion, about
having children,
cross-border abortion and childless cat ladies.
Yeah.
Cat ladies,
yeah.
And I think that that's galvanized some Republican women as well. Against, you know, or potentially pro Harris against that kind of MAGA double down project, if you like. Yeah? And then those states, there's also an issue of Gaza. She distanced herself from Netanyahu last week. So I think that there are those three plus probably you know, another two maybe. I mean, they kind of overlap and there's a lot of intersectionality, but.
I think this Israel thing last week was her big success because, well, she's still the vice president and she has to be loyal to her president, who is a big supporter of Israel, maybe not of Netanyahu, but of Israel in general. And she managed to speak in such a way that she still said, yes, I totally understand and accept Israel's rights to defend itself. But she put an emphasis on the struggle of civilians in Gaza. She mentioned dying children, she mentioned poverty, she mentioned starvation, mass expulsion from their homes. So it was a strong speech, and I think it will play well for younger voters who are way more pro-Palestinian than the older generation.
Yeah, and it also will play very well in Hollywood, because Hollywood was very much afraid to speak for Joe Biden because the young TikTok generation were pro-Palestine, so Joe Biden was kind of how to say, the cancel culture was, you know, to say that you are for Joe Biden was, you were risking to be cancelled. Actually, it's my little opinion that maybe George Clooney finally wrote this op-ed in New York Times because he was afraid to be cancelled by, and his movie Wolves is about to, he has a movie in September. And when I was watching what Democrats are doing with Joe Biden, I was thinking like, oh my God, it's like a pack of wolves. And then I saw that Joe Clooney has the movie that title Wolves, and he plays someone who finishes off bad stuff. So it's I mean how the reality and Hollywood is actually, you know, talking to each other. I don't know how to say it in a better words. It's incredible. So it's very easy to fall into all conspiracy theories from both sides, especially now from Democratic sides, because it really looks like Democrats chased away the candidate who did not do well in the polls and brought Kamala Harris kind of backdoors. Of course, legally it's not true, but it's very easy argument for.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out on the Jewish community and their voters, which is 7.5 million registered voters, approximately 5% of the registered voting population. When you compare that with the amount of Muslim voters, it's only 2.2 million, so significantly less. But the Democrats always take 70% of the Jewish vote for the last two elections.
I think is there such a thing as the Jewish vote in the States? I mean, the you know, sympathy for Israel and antipathy towards what Netanyahu's doing in Israel. There used to be a certain synonymity, right? And that's what the Israelis have attempted. Well, that's what Netanyahu's government has attempted to kind of manufacture or re-cement. And that's actually they've started to drift apart. You can be sympathetic towards the state of Israel, but be very antithetical towards what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza, right? So I don't know if the Jewish vote, it kind of really exists. I mean, it's a voice. Young Jews who are anti-Netanyahu is quite an interesting part of the discourse, but in terms of electoral politics, I don't know the extent to which that would have an impact. I think in these swing states, again, you've got significant Muslim communities. And that could, you know, if you're talking about, you know, 2-3% either way, her position, Kamala Harris's position on Gaza could have an influence in that sense. But also going back to what you said before, I think all of those things that you said are positives could also be seen as negatives, right? I mean, terms of, just simply in terms of winning the election.
Exactly.
You do have a lot of older voters who tend to vote more than younger voters as well. So if you galvanise, you know, you create some dynamism among young people, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to come out and vote, right? Whereas old Republicans who are very stuck in their politics and love Trump and Trumpism and MAGA has kind of taken over the Republican Party, they may come out in even more force simply because they consider Kamala Harris to be, you know, the representative of everything that they hate, they dislike.
The common wisdom is that the Democratic, in order for Democrats to win, they have to be way ahead in the polls, because less Democrats will actually show up for the votes. However, we never had the candidate who is a woman of color, and so much against.
It changes the game,
the
right?
elites,
it changes
actually.
the whole flavour of the election. But you still have this very strong rump of, you know, elderly Republicans in a very essentially racist society, still lingering legacies of slavery and segregation and so on. You still have people who are very anti, you know, affirmative action. They one of the slants that they've been using against Kamala Harris is that she's a product of affirmative action.
DEI,
right? That she's only there
DEI,
because of
right?
DEI.
Yeah.
And that, you know, in a sense, it kind of she embodies this choice. Yeah, are you on this side or on this side? And it's not that simple, because obviously Kamala Harris was Attorney General in California, right? So she's got quite a strong record on crime, security. You know, she's quite hard. She's quite to the right, let's say, in terms of potentially border controls, that kind of thing. If they wanted to pin that on her, kind of being weak on migration, soft on migration. So it's quite interesting to see. It will be quite interesting to see what policies she comes up with, which way she goes. If she can use that energy and kind of weaponize it in a strategic way, she has the potential to win the election, I think.
But we also need to remember that even though there's a lot of excitement right now around her candidacy, well, for obvious reasons, she's way better than Joe Biden. However, she wasn't a very popular vice president. Her ratings were around 39%. That's not entirely her fault, because Joe Biden tasked her with migration, and it was a pretty ungrateful job, because she was supposed to deal with the root causes of migration in Central America, poverty, corruption. It's not easy. So she failed in a way, because migrants are still coming in huge numbers to the US. And that might be her problem, because she will be tagged with all the negative baggage that the administration has.
Yeah, but it has also a lot of good baggage, right? The economy is booming, the inflation is down, and really America is back.
The question...
Joe Biden said America is back, and he was right. America is back on international arena. So I think it's also double sword argument.
The question if regular Americans do actually feel that the economy is doing better, that's, might be tricky.
You do
are
see
you
a
better
disconnect
off
between Trump voters who are doing economically probably worse than they ever were, and their belief in the kind of messianic Trumpism. Yeah. So the connection between economic well-being and voter choice is it's become a little bit less.
However, the miracle of taking away the being Messiah after the attempt to assassinate Donald Trump in just few days, because we just remember, I was here last week, we were talking about what Joe Biden is going to do. Few days after, we're talking about Kamala Harris, who is suddenly seen as another Messiah, actually.
Yeah, this is
absolutely amazing.
Definitely a wild race so far. Well, as Donald Trump's second term seems potentially likely still, many are wondering how his presidency might affect the war in Ukraine. Trump's closest associates over the past few years believe that they know the answers to this question. So let's go ahead and watch this next piece.
Donald Trump has repeatedly said he would end the war in Ukraine in just 24 hours. According to two Trump allies, he has no intention of ending support to Ukraine or forcing Kyiv to surrender. In a Wall Street Journal article, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former advisor to Trump David J. Urban published what they believe to be a plausible Trump peace plan for Ukraine. According to it, the war can be ended by unleashing America's energy potential, rebuilding ties with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and imposing tougher sanctions on Russia, strengthening both the American defense industry and NATO, and creating a Lend-Lease program for Kyiv, in addition to lifting restrictions on the use of US weapons by Ukrainians against Russia. In a recent interview, Volodymyr Zelensky said he would be willing to talk peace with Russia, even if it meant talking with Vladimir Putin. That's despite his previous refusals to negotiate with Putin. We will be ready to speak, along with our partners, with Russian representatives. Whether it's Putin or not Putin, what difference does it make? Let's be honest. More than a half of Ukrainians don't want to make any territorial concessions to Russia. 1/3 is, however, given that such concessions would lead to peace. These statistics were revealed in a survey published by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. Achieving peace for Ukraine was also the main purpose of the Ukrainian foreign minister's trip to China. After meeting his Chinese counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba said that Beijing reaffirmed its respect for the principle of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is very important. This removes a whole range of insinuations. My Chinese colleague made it very clear that he agrees that we do not need the illusion of peace, but we need a just and sustainable peace. This is what we should strive for. That is, we should not seek any temporary solutions.
Recently, the Russian and Ukrainian sides have both, to varying degrees, signaled their willingness to negotiate. And although the conditions are not yet in ideal setting, we support all efforts that will contribute to peace.
Beijing is yet to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and since 2022, it has only deepened its diplomatic and business ties with Moscow.
So Donald Trump has said, and he's bragged about the fact that he will end the war in Ukraine before he is even inaugurated January 20th. So between the time of the election, if he wins, and January 20th. A lot of people take this to mean that he will abandon Ukraine. He will force them to sit down at the table. He will no longer provide aid. And a lot of people are theorizing that this would be absolutely dire for the continent and for Ukraine. After looking at this piece penned by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as another senior advisor to the Trump administration, Mr. Orban, it seems that might not be the case. Joe, have you seen this piece in the Wall Street Journal? And what are your thoughts?
He makes it very explicit, or they make it very explicit at the beginning, that this is they're going to support Ukraine, right? I mean, that's the thing. It will be done, and they acknowledge also that people think that they're going to ditch Ukraine, right? And that's going to be the Trump policy because of the relationship between Trump and Putin and the Russian, and the allegations of Russian involvement, engagement in the 2016 election, that kind of thing. Obviously, it's a fantasy, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting insofar as it changes the dynamics up until the election, I think. But after the election, I think all bets are off. I personally wouldn't take this very seriously. I think it's a lot of hyperbole. I think Pompeo was, as Secretary of State, wasn't very successful. There were various things that he attempted that didn't work out. Didn't really have a very strong strategic vision. I don't know exactly what the domestic intention of this piece is, in terms of the electoral discourse. But in terms of how it will affect Ukraine, I would be very suspicious of what's being said now actually being implemented in the future.
Listening to various experts across this field that looks at Ukraine and analyzes the situation there over the past several months, one thing for me has become abundantly clear, and that is the criticism of the Biden administration for not setting a clear objective to end this war. What is it that we want to achieve? Because the tag phrase, as long as it takes, is not a strategy. Now, that's one thing that was criticized right in the beginning of this article, that this is not a good approach. So either you need to go one way, I guess, or another.
This has no deadline either, does it? I mean, does it? Does it have a...
Well, if we look at providing a $500 billion Lend-Lease program for Ukraine, taking restrictions off the types of weapons that they can use, no territorial concessions, increasing NATO spending to a minimum.
As well, right?
Well, it's definitely answering President Zelensky's dreams. It's like everything it says here. It's just whatever Ukrainians
Is
would
Lend-Lease a viable thing? I mean, they mentioned the British, the American approach to Britain during the Second World War. Lend-Lease bankrupted the UK for 40 years. I mean, it effectively ended the British Empire. That was from a British perspective, that's the way you would see it. And I'm not sure if Ukraine. I mean, first of all, where would the money come from? Who would finance this? $500 billion.
It
a lot of
looks
money.
like Europe.
Yeah, but it's saying that we
Trump
make
figure.
we make NATO stronger, we
No,
make
that's true.
sanctions stronger.
No, that is.
We will give Ukraine as much weapon as much they want, and we will let them do with the weapon whatever they want. So it's just from this perspective.
But that doesn't put any meat on the bones, right? I mean, if the criticism of Biden's strategy is that there was no end, there was no goal to be achieved, so you couldn't tell whether it was working or not. They talk about peace through strength.
And there's a lot
That doesn't mean anything.
I'm just saying that it's. I don't believe this.
But in terms of NATO,
reading it, I was thinking
NATO,
that
yes.
it's just a pure lie and strategy that for everyone who is afraid that Donald Trump would give Ukraine to Russia, just know he will.
Donald Trump has 4 more years to set his legacy. This, on day one, could be one of these areas that he could focus on, and actually it could prescribe him into the history books. Do you think he would take that opportunity?
I think so. He would love to be the hero of the world, obviously. But in this op-ed, there's a lot of wishful thinking. Like, for example, strengthening or rebuilding ties with Saudi Arabia and Israel in order to squeeze Iran and destroy Russia's military potential. That's just not going to happen, and especially not overnight, as Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours. It's a long process. And it's going to be an unsuccessful process because Saudi Arabia and various other countries in the region, they consider themselves to be middle powers. They don't want to pick sides. They think that sticking with either Russia or the West will make them lose more than just, balancing somewhere between those two camps. So, you can always say that, yes, we're going to strengthen ties with Saudi Arabia and squeeze Iran, but you have to remember that last year Saudi Arabia and Iran signed a deal brokered by China. It obviously didn't make them best friends on the international arena, but it was a step forward, showing that both Saudi Arabia and Iran believe that being enemies is not the way forward, especially now with the war in Gaza potentially spilling over to Lebanon and maybe some other parts of the Middle East. So I think they will rather stick closer than join Americans in fighting Iran. But yeah, I think this op-ed was supposed to show American allies here in Europe that yes, Trump will not abandon Ukraine. And yes, probably that's what's going to happen, because initially I read this piece in Time magazine. It was based on conversations with the representatives of the Ukrainian administration. And they all believe that maybe the first months of Trump's administration will be difficult because he would love to show this power, talk with Putin and stuff like that. But eventually he might realize that Putin wants to play him. And, well, let's put it very simply, Donald Trump doesn't like to be played, and he wants to be the hero.
He's been played for the last 10 years. He doesn't know that he's being played. That's the
thing, yeah. But it
in the sense of Ukraine,
in the sense of Putin, I would imagine.
Sense of Putin. Well, I mean, there are lots of accusations that Donald Trump somehow colluded with the Russians to win the election back in 2016. Of course, you had Hillary Clinton commission the Steele report. So there's still kind of a lot of unsettled dust, even.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's.
But Donald Trump did give. This needs to be mentioned. He was the first to give Ukraine offensive weapons.
He
that
was the
something
first
that
to allow the states to give Ukraine offensive weapons, but they didn't actually provide anything. I mean, that's the difference.
Stinger missiles.
Well, they did after 2022, or they have done since the war, you know, the full-scale invasion started. But they, from, was it 2017, 2017, I think. It was a symbolic gesture saying that, you know, we are prepared to support Ukraine's ambitions and, you know, provide it with, you know, military hardware. But actually, what they provided was quite minimal. You know, I think the interesting thing is not necessarily whether or not Trump was in collusion with some kind of Russian interests. I think the interesting thing is that their interests ideologically kind of coincide. There's a similarity between what the Russians would want in relation to a kind of a weaker European Union, for example, and the Americans would also be interested in that. It diffuses the potential for Europe to become a rival, let's say, in the future.
I think one of the things at the heart of this plan is making Europe pay significantly more, and I believe there's a proposal to, once they can stop the fighting, allow Ukraine to join NATO immediately, but that Europe needs to provide a $100 billion arms package for Ukraine.
No, I think
fund.
it's 100 million.
$100 billion fund for
United
Ukraine.
States pays only 20%.
And Europe would pay 80%, and the United States only 20%.
But that should happen even if Kamala Harris wins. I mean, we
well,
should
I think
take
that's
more
the trend
responsibility.
that we're going to see, because if we now think about the U.S. having to deal with the situation in Asia with China, I think it's very doubtful that Europe will contribute very much to that part of the world. Therefore, Europe needs to probably step up and take care of.
We've seen over the last few months. Sikorski in Poland has been quite clear, quite explicit about the fact that Europe does need to create its own defence policy. It does need to have its own arms manufacturing industry and so on. And then there needs to be a much stronger coordination amongst European states to create some kind of defence force. And he said, I think, was it last week, he said something about Taiwan. The Americans, whether it's Kamala Harris or it may even have been when Biden was still in the race, he said that basically American foreign policy is going to pivot. Mm-hmm. It's going to turn much more directly towards Taiwan. Trump's position on Taiwan is a bit confused as far as I understand it. But anyway, the point is that, you know, the European Union, the European Defence Force is a real issue. Actually, the collusion, if that's what it was, ideological or otherwise, between Russia and between the Kremlin and Trump, has actually made it much clearer within Europe that this is what we need, or this is what is needed in order for Europe to be able to defend itself.
And we will never know, actually, how much Donald Trump contributed to Europe getting really stronger and NATO being more mobilized and really knowing that there is not a joke. We really have to be together, because even Joe Biden will be no more, and even with Kamala Harris, probably the eyes of America will never look to Europe with so much understanding and care as with Joe Biden. So I really think that with this president we are saying goodbye to someone who really understood the processes in Europe, really understood the importance of the peace on the continent, and so we really have to be stronger. And this is actually a great chance for Poland to play a very
Poland has played a
leading role,
very strong role in those regards. If we look back with a little bit of 2020 hindsight, just at the first couple months of this year, you saw leaders in Europe scrambling to increase their defense spending in anticipation of Donald Trump returning to the White House. What is it, 23 or 24 NATO countries now have reached the 2% minimum spending in defense. By the end of this year.
These are pledges as well, though, aren't they? I mean,
right. So it could probably turn around if we see Kamala Harris.
And each country counts it in a different way, so it's a bit tricky.
Yep.
There's also, can I just say one last thing? A European defence force would also be potentially a rival for NATO, right? And because America is the biggest, obviously, biggest arms manufacturer, and it invests huge amounts in research and development, technological development, militarization, and so on. A European defence industry would be a threat to that. So there's another element to this, I think, which is...
It would be, but then again, if we look back at Libya, in that situation, France essentially asked Barack Obama for American assets because Europe simply didn't have them. So it's been U.S. policy for decades.
That's
right?
the point, right? I mean, if there's a kind of contradiction built into the U.S. policy because they want Europe to be much more proactive.
Well, I think we're seeing a changing world, where the United States was always responsible in many regards for European security, but now we're in a different place post-Cold War. And I think that also needs to be formulated across the Atlantic, and a policy needs to come up and say, well, yes, okay, this is our policy. We want Europe to take care of more of its security. And I don't think the competition with military-industrial base would.
Well, I mean, there is a
deal.
One of the arguments that's that goes around is obviously that the American desire for not desire, but the way in which American military interests coincide with their kind of private sector interests is quite a strong determining factor, quite a strong driving factor in various parts of the world. If Europe were to have its own independent capability, productive capability, it would change, for example, potentially Europe's foreign policy position on Israel. Potentially, I would imagine there would be a lot of European states who would be less sympathetic towards supporting Israel. There may not be this competition. It may be that they, international capital somehow finds a way of integrating both American and European interests, right? So it may be. You may be correct, but an independent Europe would probably have a very different kind of foreign policy sensibility.
And America will be able to concentrate on space and arm race in space, which comes to, whom Kamala Harris will pick for vice president. And if it will be former astronaut Mark Kelly, it will be a great choice.
That'll be interesting to see whether exactly who that pick is and when that pick will happen, whether it happens before the Democratic National Convention, which is coming up in just a few weeks, or not. Well, final thoughts very quickly before we conclude.
Well, the vice president is going to be the white man to contradict sort of Kamala Harris.
The DEI pick.
Yeah.
Has to be a white man.
Exactly.
Middle-aged white man.
It might play well.
And we are not afraid to say so.
Yeah.
That's what it is, really. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it might play well for her. If she chooses a white man in his 50s, 60s, something like that, straight, traditional guy.
She needs a neutral pick.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Trump has made a mistake in the sense of picking J.D. Vance because he's kind of, if you're not going to do anything positive, don't do anything negative, right? That's the adage. And he's actually he's made negative noises for the campaign. It's actually damaged. So I would imagine Kelly, it's Kelly, right?
Senator Kelly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Somebody like that.
Well, we have still some time to go until November. It's going to be a very probably bumpy but very interesting road. Well, that concludes this edition of Press Corner. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to all of our guests for sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.